Welcome back to the channel. Here's a question for you. Was the 2023 Rugby World Cup the best World Cup ever? Something I've been thinking about really. A couple of weeks on from the World Cup final. Time's flying, by the way, since then. Thinking about my time out in France, having been fortunate enough to be out there. And I think there's a case for and a case against really. So that's what I'm going through in this video. The reasons I think you could argue it's the best World Cup ever, and reasons that maybe you would say it wasn't. You can drop a comment down below. Let me know what you made of it, whether you were out in France or whether you were watching it at home, because I think those two different experiences will inform your view on whether you think it was the best you've ever seen. But it's an interesting discussion, so drop a comment down below, like the video, and also subscribe to the channel as well, so make sure you don't miss anything coming up. Before we know it, international rugby will be back with the Six Nations, and I'll still keep trying to do content on the channel. Actually, it's been kind of interesting. Some of you may have noticed I haven't been uploading quite as frequently since the World Cup. It was much easier to, well, not easy, but when you've got a World Cup, to try and do a video every day, whereas now that things have settled down a little bit, I've kind of scaled back the amount of videos, but I will still be doing my best to post regularly, so do make sure you're subscribed. But anyway, let's get into it. Was the 2023 World Cup the best Rugby World Cup ever? I think you can split this into on the pitch and the rugby we saw, and then off the pitch and some of the issues we saw. So I'm going to start with on the pitch, because that is the most important factor really when we're talking about this question and trying to answer it. I think there is a good case to be made, in fact a very strong case to be made, that the knockout rounds were the best knockout rounds we have ever seen. When you consider the only game that wasn't close was New Zealand's semi-final against Argentina. What was it, 44-6. The game was done in the first half easily by the time we got to halftime, and probably earlier before that. Other than that, we had 4 quarterfinals, 2 of which, the ones in Paris, people have been speaking about as were they the greatest games of rugby that we've ever seen. Plus the other 2 quarterfinals down in Marseille maybe weren't of the same quality, but they went down to the wire. They were tense. They could have gone either way. They were exciting. So 4 brilliant quarterfinals. Then the England-South Africa semi-final, which was won by just a point. Even the bronze medal match, which I know a lot of people don't particularly care about, but you look at that between England and Argentina, and that was a close game. Could have gone either way. And then the final itself, won by a single point. Excuse me. Another game that was really close. So when you look at the whole knockout rounds, I think that is it's going to be incredibly hard for that to be matched. For that many games, knockout rugby to be that close. It was the best knockout games we've ever seen, I think, at the World Cup. And even then, when you throw in the final, people suggesting it might be the best World Cup final we've ever seen. I know it was tense and it was a wet and rainy and a certain style of game, but it made it incredibly exciting, particularly that second half. You then look at the Springboks in terms of an individual team, winning all of those knockout games by a point, having to come through the hardest pool we've ever seen in the history of the World Cup. That is the hardest run to a World Cup final we have ever seen, and may never be matched again, because the way that they're going to be doing the draw is going to change, which will hopefully make things more easily. But you factor that in, and then that pool stage I speak about. I know there's been complaints about the draw. They're not going to do it that way again. It was because of COVID. They did the draw early. It meant it was so lopsided. But actually, I think it made it the best pool stage we've ever seen, because it gave us France against New Zealand as an opening fixture. We've never seen that sort of thing before. It gave us the likes of Ireland, South Africa, and that Pool B was just brilliant, with Scotland in there as well, and how many great games we had. And then, because it was lopsided, England's pool was interesting. Wales's pool was interesting, even with the Wallabies not being particularly good, but with Portugal turning up, what we saw from Fiji, and actually those emerging nations are another massive part of this conversation of what we saw on the pitch. Portugal, Uruguay, Fiji, the joy that those teams brought, the rugby we saw on the pitch was outstanding. And actually, I think the lopsided draw helped in a way, even though it maybe wasn't fair on the likes of Scotland or Ireland or teams like that you feel would have got further if they weren't on that side of it. It made it overall as a spectacle more exciting. Plus then, and this I thought was quite an interesting stat, 325 tries scored across the whole of the tournament. That's only second to 2003, and I don't think the 2003 World Cup is necessarily remembered as having loads of tries, maybe because the international landscape was more lopsided then between the smaller teams and the higher teams, and maybe because England were the team that won it, who did it off the back of a big forward pack and the boot of Johnny Wilkinson. But I thought it was interesting that 2003 has had the most tries scored in the history of a men's World Cup. And actually, something I touch on there, the international landscape of rugby, I think is tighter and more competitive than ever, both at the top and maybe even some of those teams coming through as well. So in terms of the rugby, I think there are loads of reasons you could say that it was the best World Cup we've ever seen. However, there are some downsides to this part of the conversation. It was too long. World Rugby themselves have admitted that. A 7-week World Cup. I think the uneven amount of teams in the pools was a mistake, something they're correcting for the next one. The fact that teams had rest weeks, it just dragged, didn't it, a little bit, the pool stages, and it lost momentum, which is saying a lot when you consider what I've just said about how brilliant that some of those pools were and the great fixtures we had within them. The fact that the pools still dragged a little bit, they lost momentum in the middle of it. It felt like it was too long, that section of the tournament. That loss of momentum, I think, was a massive, massive shame. Those are my arguments for the on-the-pitch stuff. Overall, we're looking pretty good so far. Let me move to the off-field side of it, because this is where I think there start to be a few more negatives. And these, I think, are things that are going to affect the fans that are out there a lot more, but that's also really significant. And they're also quite small things in isolation. I think it's the build-up of them is when it became more of an issue, and maybe the fan experience wasn't as good as previous World Cups. If you were out in France as a fan, let me know. Obviously, the majority of the time I was out there working. I did go to a game in Nice kind of as more of a fan, so saw some side of it where I wasn't sitting in the media section. But a few different things. First of all, fans struggling to get to stadiums. This was more of an issue in different cities, but Nice in particular wasn't particularly easy to get to. They did put on some shuttle buses, but the tram took quite a while, was really, really busy. I know in other places as well, it was quite hard for the fans to actually get themselves from where they were staying or the centre of town out towards the stadiums. The transport links weren't necessarily always the best. And also running out of beer, which was something that happened on the opening weekend. We saw as well that game in Marseille with the England fans, loads of them having to queue for a long time to try and get in. Stadiums running out of beer. Again, when I was there in Nice, we turned up at the Wales-Portugal game, and a couple of friends I was with wanted to get a beer. And it was honestly a load of teenagers who had got a summer job working at the World Cup, didn't know how to pour a pint. Organisation was terrible, took forever. Little things like that, which you might listen to and say, well, you're at a World Cup, it's not the end of the world. They build up eventually. I also think actually travelling around France was not easy and expensive in terms of how spread out it was across all of the country. Accommodation was incredibly expensive. I had a friend who has a flat in Marseille, and putting it on Airbnb, usually you'd be looking at about 150 euros a night. When the games were on, it was 1,000 euros a night, which just gives you a bit of an indication. In some of those smaller cities where the demand became so high, the cost of accommodation skyrocketed. You can imagine if that was what it was like for just privately letting your flat, what the hotels and things like that were. I think that was probably an issue for some fans as well. And also away from that, but still I think important in terms of an off-field issue, this blackout on content creators. Now, fortunately, I'm not doing anything on this channel at the moment which uses highlights or anything like that, but people like Squidge Rugby, a lot of other people that look to use highlights and create conversations around the game, basically had their content removed. They weren't able to do it, and I don't exactly know all the issues for this. World Rugby have got their World Rugby studios now. They bought Rugby Pass. They're looking to bring more things in-house, probably looking to control it all a lot more. But it's just a massive shame for a sport like rugby, which needs to grow. It's not the biggest sport, even though sometimes in the middle of a World Cup it can feel like the be-all and end-all. Compared to a lot of other sports, it's not. If you follow an NFL game on a Sunday night or any sort of American sport like that, your timeline will be filled of highlights, of clips, of ways to be able to follow the game and consume the game on social media, which rugby to me seems to be shooting itself in the foot at the moment. So that I think was a disappointing issue. But there were some good stuff off the field as well. I can't paint it all as bad. Atmospheres were brilliant. The different fan groups, the Argentinians, the Portuguese, the Irish who travelled, all the different fans bring so many different elements to a World Cup. The atmosphere was sensational. The The amount of tickets sold was really, really high. Even at the smaller games, there were very few empty seats. In fact, interestingly, I thought it was some of the England games in the pool stages, in terms of what I was at, that looked to have a few more blocks of empty seats. On the whole, ticket sales sky high. Atmosphere brilliant. It was still a great occasion for the fans. I'm not saying it was all bad, but I think there were some issues there. So let's round it off. Was it the best World Cup ever? I think there's a very good case to be made that the on-pitch rugby, from that point of view, it's the best World Cup we've ever seen, particularly because of how good the knockout stages were. But I think the pool stages, even though they dragged, we got some great matchups as well. I think from an on-pitch point of view, I don't know if it's necessarily ever been better, particularly when you consider how competitive it is at the top of the game. How often have we gone into a World Cup and you've had Ireland and France up there, you've had South Africa there, you've had New Zealand there, you've got 4 teams that you're looking at and thinking they could all win it. It's so competitive and we got some great games. But I think there were too many small off-the-field details that they got wrong, which means I don't think you can fully say that this is the best World Cup ever. It was a great World Cup. I wasn't in Japan 4 years ago. Speaking to colleagues that were out of Japan, they seem to feel that as an event, as an experience, as an occasion, was more memorable. It was brilliant. France is a great country. They love their rugby. The rugby itself was brilliant. I personally think there were too many small details, which means it maybe wasn't the best World Cup ever. But you can let me know in the comments section, what do you make of it? And what was your experience? Whether you were watching at home and consuming the games on TV, or whether you were out there in France, what was your experience of it? Do you think it was the best World Cup ever? Comment down below. Make sure you like the video as well. And also make sure you're subscribed to the channel. But I'll see you in the next one.